Hello and welcome to an interview with part of a series of conversations with industry-leading professionals across the risk and governance markets. My name's Rob Starkl, managing partner here at the Risk Partners, and I am thrilled to be joined today by Philip Best. Philip is the Chief Risk Officer and Group Head of Compliance at Tilney, Smith & Williamson. He has a wealth of experience across risk management at an executive level, working for firms such as Barclays Wealth, UFJI London and Columbia Threadneedle Investments. Philip, thank you for joining us today.
Pleasure, nice to be here.
Really appreciate your time today, and hopefully our viewers will enjoy what we have to say. So to start the conversation, our listeners are always interested in hearing about people's journey and how they actually got into risk management. So it'd be great to hear how that happened for yourself.
Yeah, I guess as one of those things that proves that you can do pretty much whatever you want to in life. I was an IT strategy consultant working on a risk project, and one day they were short of a risk consultant.
Oh, wow.
And I had read up and taught myself all about value at risk at that point in time. And so I put my hand up and said, I think I can do that. They were doubtful. But they asked me a few questions. I seemed to pass the test, so I got into risk on the consultancy side. Pretty soon after, though, I left the consultancy I was with,
right,
and went to what is now Mizuho. You refer to as IBJI.
Yep.
As head of market risk. Actually, I was market risk. There was no one else.
Right. Wow.
And it was a steep learning curve, I have to say. First day down on the trading floor, I went to found the head of trading, introduced myself. I said, I'm your new head of risk. And he says, that's what I do.
Oh.
In retrospect, I look back on that. It kind of took my legs away when he said that. But actually, it's the perfect answer. That's exactly what you want a head of front office to say.
Of course.
But it's like I started out in market risk, learned how to do that in practice rather than theory. And that was that. I guess I kind of accumulated responsibility for credit risk, and I thought that market risk is the easiest of the three, and then credit risk gets a bit more complicated. And the one I always wanted to avoid was operational risk, because you can't just simply quantify it or control it. It's the whole way the organisation works. But eventually, I've had to take responsibility for that as well.
So when you had that conversation with that front office individual, how different would you say risk management as an entity was then and relative to now?
Yeah, I mean, this was way back, early 90s. I think the big banks, because the consultancy I was with, we'd done a fair amount of work with BZW, helping them set up their market risk framework, and that was one of the first. But when I arrived at what is now Mizuho, it was very early days. There was virtually nothing in place.
Right.
So there was no overall computation of risk. There were no limits on risk. So the front office guys had their own kind of knowledge of what was going on, but there was no framework. Okay. There was no risk committee.
Wow.
It was pretty early days, and I'm thinking it's great to go through that, because that's when you learn a lot, trying to work it out from first principles.
Absolutely. So you must have then gone through that whole process of literally greenfield site. Now we're going to go and draw a map, draw a plan in terms of how we're going to roll this out. How, out of interest, how was that received with the business? Because that must have been a real kind of shift in terms of clearly the rudimental risk management they must have done initially.
Yeah, I was lucky, I think, with the head of the front office. Despite his initial reaction to me, he actually got what we were trying to do, and supported us. We quite quickly put in place a framework of limits and monitoring and reporting.
Right.
Built on spreadsheets, of course. And he was quite supportive. Not all areas of the front office, of course, were quite so supportive, particularly when you've got a set of limits and then you're suddenly pitching up at the desk going, excuse me, you're through your limits, you need to reduce your position.
Right.
So, of course, you get into that conversation pretty shortly. But It was a step forward for the business, undoubtedly, and the majority of the front office did accept it.
Right. It's interesting. We obviously talked to a lot of people who've kind of been through that, and even today, still firms that are playing catch up in some cases in terms of rolling that out in certain industries. Some would argue that banking is a little more advanced in terms of, from the regulatory side, in terms of what they need to be to achieve, versus the buy side, where if some of the smaller firms perhaps are still implementing and going through that journey. I guess you've seen it, well, certainly on one occasion, if not more, that journey.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, I think I've sort of set up market risk frameworks at least 3 times over the years.
Wow. And it is, when you've done that on those occasions, are the challenges the same, or is it dependent specifically on the business that it's within?
I think that the fundamental challenge is the same, because you're basically trying to understand the risk that the organization has, and then put in place an appropriate control framework. I mean, one thing I would say about market risk is that it's, as is true also for other risk types, is that it's always different. There's almost an infinite varieties of specific kind of products or markets or exposures that an organization can have exposure to, and you obviously have to understand that. I think if you look at kind of some of the market risk disasters that have happened over the years, it's where they didn't spot a particular kind of type of risk or concentration.
Yes.
In markets.
Yeah.
Products.
Well, that quite neatly leads on to my next question, actually. Obviously, in the past few years, we've seen some pretty big events take place across the market, notably Brexit, COVID, and of course now the Ukraine situation. From a risk management standpoint, how do you plan for these seemingly unexpected events?
Yeah, with great difficulty. Of course, the formal answer is that one does it through scenario and stress testing, and that's the only way you can do it. Unfortunately, as human beings, we are phenomenally bad at predicting what's going to happen next, and also we underrate the frequency or probability of these kind of extreme events. We always think they're less likely. Whenever you're running a scenario workshop and you've done a lot of prep and you've come up with things that you think could happen, and you stand up in front of the executive team and say, "Now I want to examine this particular scenario," they'll look at, quite a few of them will look at you like you're cooking. Like, fine, we're doing this because you want us to, Philip, but we don't really believe it's going to happen.
Right.
And it is true in some respects that what you've worked up a scenario and stress test around doesn't happen, but something equally weird and at least as severe does happen. I think it's very, very difficult. All you can do is, one thing I would say is, if you go through a process of scenario analysis with an executive team, they are affected by that. They can't walk away without that thought process going through their mind.
Yes.
So I always found it, particularly sort of the market risk side, you talk to people about what could happen if they're running large positions on stuff, and even if they didn't agree with you in the meeting, you would find their behavior changed afterwards.
Really?
Because they can't, even if they want to, they're psychologically affected by the discussion you've had, and that's true with executive teams as well. So maybe there's a sort of hidden agenda with heads of risk or people in risk when they're having these discussions is, yes, you're going to poo-poo the precise scenario, but where I'm really going with this is what is the organization's operational resilience like to events like this?
Yes.
And that will get the executive team thinking about, how do we respond? How do we get comms? How do we deal with crises? What happens if IT gets hurt? So it does add value, and it does change the way executive teams think.
So it's about encouraging that discussion and highlighting those principles. So rather than drilling down to specifics, if this happens, it's more of a question of, okay, what does the bigger picture look like from a governance perspective, and it should something like that arise?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. So that's really interesting. And then I guess from an executive level, it's about how much that does impact them, and you almost want them to be walking out of that room and starting to think about these things and making decisions based on some of those concepts that you've discussed. has it always, in your experience, has it always been like that? Have the executive level always been open to ideas on that, but or has that been an evolution as risk compliance governance has sort of taken off?
You know what, I've generally found executive teams quite enjoy it.
Okay.
Obviously it depends how you set it up, but it's an opportunity to do some blue sky thinking.
Right.
And they enjoy that, generally, executive teams. It obviously, I'm trying to sort of put it down to, well, let's speak practicalities here. Where are our defenses? What the state of our defensive and controls in the organization? Let's try and spot our weak places,
Right.
so we can think about the next budget round, how we need to invest to basically try and shore up or strengthen our defenses, in a general sense.
And again, this is just generally, do you find that there is acceptance that ultimately these things we're discussing here is a cost to the business,
Yep.
right? But a necessary cost to
Yep.
to the business. Have you found then that over the years, given we've experienced some pretty big events, 2008 financial crisis, there's been AML breaches and fines, you know, we've seen collapses of organizations, bearings, funds, etc. Given the learnings then from these incidents, has that made them you know, more accepting of that cost that is required there, you know, and has that then allowed the frameworks and policies, etc., that you're putting in place, has that been able to make it more effective then?
To a certain extent. Another observation I'd have about human behavior is people have pretty short memories.
Okay.
So unless it's something that's happened pretty recently in terms of history, executives don't put much weight on it happening.
Right.
Saying that's just human nature again. I think more importantly has actually been the advancement of risk appetite frameworks in conjunction with scenario analysis. So, for instance, we have a risk appetite around what we call kind of severe but plausible events. So, what's the kind of maximum operational disruption we're prepared to tolerate, or maximum financial loss we're prepared to tolerate, given certain types of scenarios? Doesn't particularly matter what that scenario is. And that makes people then say, well, if you accept that risk appetite statement, basically, and this scenario shows that if these two or three scenarios, if they happen, show that we'd go through that in terms of operational disruption or financial loss, then we have an issue. And we need to invest to try and bring our exposure down below that risk appetite, or we need to have a conversation about risk appetite. So it's that combination of kind of the risk appetite framework plus the scenario analysis, which I think have that kind of discipline in risk management has grown up and matured quite a lot over the last 20 odd years, right, to a point where it's now reasonably effective.
So I guess you're almost working backwards and saying, you know, what are you prepared to lose in this scenario? Okay, let's invest upfront to prevent that happening.
Absolutely. And I always use the expression risk tolerance rather than risk appetite or loss appetite, because if I have stood in front of the board and said, what's your appetite for loss? They'll just look at me like I'm bonkers and go, well, 0. Yep. Okay, thanks. But now let's assume one of these severe but plausible events happens. You know, what's your tolerance? Because they will happen. Stuff will go wrong. What's your tolerance for whether it's operational disruption, regulatory disruption, client disruption, financial loss? Talk to me about your tolerance for that. Obviously, you need to see that conversation, but that normally is a constructive conversation.
Yes. And do you tend to find people are joined up in their thinking in terms of those losses, or does it make it interesting when you have differing views on that?
Generally they are. Actually, they coalesce quite rapidly. Again, it depends how you lay out your risk appetite or loss tolerance statement, but not had a problem coalescing minds on that. You can normally reach consensus.
No, that's really good, because one of the points that's come up in other conversations that I've had has been about the top-down approach to risk management. If it's coming from the top and those decisions are made, it becomes much more straightforward then for you to implement and design around that and get everybody on board, not only just within the risk and compliance teams, for example, but then the business on board with that as well. And I guess if you've got that plan, you've got that tolerance established, you've got that roadmap in place, it must be much easier to deliver on those things to then prevent these issues from happening.
Absolutely, it provides a basis for challenge when we're changing systems or whatever an organization is doing, to say, have you considered, how have you made sure that you're going to stay inside of our tolerance for operational disruption, for instance? Yes.
Interesting. Yeah, very interesting. So I guess under your remit, then there's a plethora of different considerations across risk management and compliance. Are there any, here we are in March 22, are there any in particular that you see as the biggest challenges across risk and compliance for this year and beyond?
Well, obviously I'm talking to you, the week after or 2 weeks after the war in Ukraine started. I think even before that, the global economics economy was facing some challenges in terms of supply of people, supply of goods, inflation, and I think the war in Ukraine is going to accentuate all of that. And it's interesting, if I look back to the financial crisis in 2008, one of the interesting stroke distressing things that happened was that various different scenarios all happened at once. And maybe we're going to see that again. We've got the economic impact on what was already quite a fragile economic situation globally. And also there's a lot of talk around about cyber warfare and how that's going to play out. Cyber risk has been our top risk. Actually, for the last 2 or 3 organizations I've worked at, it's been the top risk in organization for at least a decade.
Right.
And what's going on now obviously heightens that even more. I also think organizations are probably not well equipped to deal with extended periods of inflation.
Okay.
We're just not used to it. And sort of analyzing that and thinking it through takes quite a bit of effort. And back to my previous point, that people aren't very good at thinking those things through quite often, or they don't kind of predict things in the correct way. I suspect there's going to be a few organizations that get hurt by what is now going to be obviously quite a prolonged and quite severe bout of inflation.
Yes. So this is the longer term impacts following that, you think is going to be one of the core things that the firms are going to have to keep an eye out for.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Do you think, just referencing back to the cyber security issues that you mentioned there, do you think that situations prior to Ukraine and Russia at the moment, do you think things like the SolarWinds hack and other events that have happened have now made us more resilient for attacks like this?
Yeah, I think so. You can't, if you're a CEO watching this stuff happen on the news, it's got to be giving you a sleepless night.
Of course.
Too. So I think all organizations have now, or decent sized organizations have certainly invested a lot of money in cyber defenses. Mm-hmm. But we'll never be there. It's an arms race. Every time we think we put up defenses against the threats we know about, new threats come along. So it's going to be a continual going on stream of investment that's required to basically control cyber risk. Mm-hmm. But I think I shouldn't say this because it's really then inviting challenge and disaster. If you look about the number of sort of corporate disasters that are happening in the cyberspace, it's actually relatively few. Okay. So that shows that people's defenses are pretty good, because if you ever go and talk to your guy in an organization who's heading up cybersecurity and ask him about the number of attacks that are happening every single day, it's just unbelievable. It's mind-boggling. Right. So therefore, the base level of defenses, I think, is now much higher than it was a decade ago. And it will continue to get stronger still. I think one of the challenges for organizations has been getting IT stroke the cybersecurity guys to come and talk to boards or executive teams in a way they can understand.
Because it's complicated.
Yeah, because it's complicated, it's very technical, and we all love jargon, and they certainly do.
Right.
And it's a matter of, I think, again, risk functions can help in that, helping them sort of frame the risks that they're seeing or the problems that they're seeing in terms of the cyber defenses in a business risk kind of way, which can then be presented to the board and said, so we spend this much, we'll have these exposures, and if we spend a bit more, we can defend. Because again, it is a risk and return trade-off, as in many areas of risk management.
Yes. So again, it's defining that risk tolerance in order
Yep.
to then to make that investment in preventing that. Yeah, it's very interesting. And do you find, because again, different organizations are structured in a different way in order to tackle cyber defense, risk management obviously has a key part to play in that. Of course, your cyber team specifically that are focusing on that, and then of course your more IT teams as well within that, depending on where it's structured. In your experience, has there been good cohesion between those departments? Should it sit under, in your view, should it sit under one department? How do you kind of manage that?
Yeah, I'm not too worried about where it happens. Risk, typically cybersecurity or information security, certainly cybersecurity sits inside IT. I don't have a problem with that. I think they need to work closely with risk. They typically do, in my experience. Sometimes risk needs to go and kind of make sure that's the case. But I see that, again, that kind of working together with risk has matured over the last few years, and you see that a lot more now. Before, it used to be a bunch of guys, very techie guys stuck away in a corner somewhere, who didn't really speak to that many people. That has changed and needed to change badly, because you can't have someone doing business critical risk management work for you, which is basically what they're doing, unless they're able to articulate and explain what they're doing to the rest of the organization. So probably more to go there in certain organizations, but it's come along.
Yeah. And it seems to be that is the real art to this, is distilling down, like you say, these difficult technical concepts that most of us find it difficult to comprehend, to then distill that down into say, okay, this is what it means, this is what the reality is, this is what it's going to cost the organization.
Yep.
Interesting. So yeah, arms race, I think, is probably a good way to describe it, because they're ever more intelligent than previously, right? So okay. Moving the subject on, another key theme at the moment, of course, is ESG, having sort of come sharply into focus here. In your opinion, can financial services be truly green? Is that possible?
It's a tough one. It depends what you mean by financial services being green. I mean, I think it's relatively easy for most financial services firms to have a pretty low carbon footprint, but that's probably not what you mean. You probably mean their impact and lending specifically to the wider economy.
Yeah.
I don't think they can go faster than the rest of society, is my honest view. People are saying, why are the banks still lending to Shell and BP? Well, if we don't, or if the banks don't, we'll have no oil and gas. And by the way, look where that's got us in terms of our dependence on places people we'd rather not be dependent on. And now the British government is now talking about sort of reopening investment in North Sea oil and gas. And I can understand that. And you could also argue it's carbon neutral. Right? If we dig it out of the ground here, then we're not digging it out of the ground in Russia. So globally, it's a carbon neutral thing. And I'd rather not be dependent on Russia personally. So I don't think, we can't, if as an industry we cut off finance to oil and gas, what are we going to do? We can't, the globe can't support itself in terms of renewable energy at this point in time, and it's going to be 10, 15 years before it can. So I don't think we can go further and faster than the rest of society and the rest of the economy. Yes. We have to match it, would be how I would put it.
So it's more a question of making more investment into those green and renewable sources rather than cutting off from the existing supply.
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of pressures to do both, and you see financial services organizations doing both of those things.
Yes,
they're moving strongly in that direction. but you can't just cut off dirty investment and make sure all of your investments are all green, because that's not where the economy is.
Yes. How does that then link into reputational risk? Is that something that is discussed often in terms of how the firm is perceived in the market as far as climate change and ESG?
Yeah.
Is that coming up in conversation?
It does a lot. Yep. I think whole financial services is under massive pressure to move towards sustainable investments or sustainable lending, green lending. And given what I've just said, that we can't simply walk away from investing in things which cause additional carbon to be released into the atmosphere, it's a tough one. I think the smart organizations can have a policy around moving in that direction, and are moving in that direction, and it'll probably happen faster than we think, that we'll move away from a carbon-based economy, but it's going to take time. And I think financial services organizations need to make sure they're being very upfront and honest about what they can do and what they can't do.
Yes. Yeah.
Sometimes you find these discussions on just not framed honestly. It's like they try to say, yes, we're making all our investments green, rather than saying we want to make all our investments green, but we can't walk away from lending to oil and gas.
Yes.
Or we shouldn't.
So like you say, it's as society pushes it and changes it, and hopefully we're doing this fast enough now. Do you think this is a new concept, or do you think it's always been around, sort of in terms of sustainable investing? Do you think it's always been around, but now there's just it's come into sharper focus?
I think with the focus it's got these days, it's pretty new. I can think back a decade with an organization I was with launching green funds. So it has been around as a concept for some while, but I think now it's got a much sharper focus, and rightly so. It's do or die time for us as a human population. I think we've got to get this right, and finance can lead that way. We can put a lot of pressure on organizations like Shell, BP, and the others to convert themselves into green energy producers, etc.
Are you seeing much pressure from the regulators at the moment on this subject?
They are certainly, they're not pushing, well, we're not a bank, so I don't know what they're doing with the banks, but they're certainly pushing us to look very carefully around sustainability and also around climate risk analysis and frameworks. So that is pressure across the whole of financial services.
Okay. So I guess another key theme that has been coming up from conversations we've been having with clients is the agenda this year as far as operational resilience is concerned. How much, I guess, input from a risk management standpoint to get things up to speed from what the regulators are now saying with various white papers they're producing in terms of the roadmap on operational resilience, obviously off the back of the scenarios that we've discussed so far. From your side, is there a real roadmap to get things up to speed for that, or do you think you're pretty well prepared given the topics that we've talked about?
So I suspect it's going to be partly driven by the size of organization. A few years ago, I was working for one of the large banks, and they had done an awful lot of work on operational resilience. Now, working for a smaller organization, we've done slightly less, and we've definitely got a roadmap in front of us to get there. So I think most organizations are working very hard on it, including the big ones, because they've got a bigger job to do.
Do you think it's as much of an investment as, say, the cyber piece that we've discussed?
Yes, easily, probably more.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. So it's a really big agenda, a really big topic.
That's the big thing. It's not just a framework. You've actually got to, coming back to kind of tolerance or risk appetite and tolerance for operational disruption, which is one of the key themes in operational resilience. That costs real money. If you can run a scenario where a couple of your key systems go down and you suffer significant operational resilience, then to fix that, to bring that exposure down to below your risk appetite, costs a lot of money.
Right. Wow. Okay. Which then would explain why the regulator is putting so much emphasis on it this year, and again getting the conversation going.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense. actually. I think it's I have a lot of sympathy what the regulators are trying to achieve in that space.
Yes. In general, do you find that, again, from a risk and compliance standpoint, is it a difficult task? Because obviously we're seeing so many new regulations come through, so many changes, it's evolving, and I guess it always will, based on the environment that we see around us and in front of us. Is it difficult in general to keep pace with that, or how do you find it?
Yes, it is difficult.
It is.
We had the expression from the FCA, there will be a tsunami of regulation post-financial crisis. In sort of my very limited experience of tsunamis is they come and go quite quickly. The sort of wave of regulation we've had post-financial crisis has not really subsided. It's just massive. It's ongoing. Obviously we've spoken about operational resilience, very well grounded, I think, from what the regulator's trying to achieve there. And we've got in my area of the industry, we've got a lot of new stuff coming on board over the next year or two. Consumer duty, for example, which is going to be quite a big effort across the industry.
Okay.
And it just never seems to be letting up.
Right.
So we'll see. I suspect I'll probably be retired by the time it actually finally lets up, if it ever does.
And then you can read it in the paper whilst you're skiing, right? At that
Absolutely.
point. So sounds great. Okay, Philip, that's been great. Thank you for your viewpoint on those subjects. It's really interesting hearing your viewpoint on it, because if you've seen these waves and these changes over the years, it's going to be interesting to see where we end up, in another 10 years with what's in front of us. I know from conversations that we're having with candidates and clients, it is always that next thing. It's always about that learning, that development, and there are so many courses now that people can go on to sort of bring their knowledge up to speed and be able to be, a risk manager these days is a Swiss Army knife. They've got to be able to turn their hand to whatever task is in front of them, and it's a really evolving skill set. And of course, we've got some very specialist disciplines within that, but there's a real change, in my opinion, in terms of what are the requirements for a risk manager these days, and I guess some of the themes we've touched on today are going to continue to push that, and new themes that are coming up.
Yeah, I think there's parallels with sort of cyber, which, as I was saying, used to be done by some guys in a back room somewhere. That was true of risk management when I started out in it. There's a bunch of bright quants sat in a room calculating market risk. These days, the job of a CRO is to make sure that the organization is eyes wide open to the risks that it's taking, and where it wants to take those risks, that it does so knowingly.
Absolutely.
Probably the most important job I've got.
Yeah. And the importance of it, I guess that's why we're seeing more CROs take on CEO jobs these days as well. So to understand that's going to be fundamental as part of the future strategy making for many financial services firms.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Brilliant. Well, look, Philip, thank you so much for your time today. It's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much for that. Great talking to you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all for listening. Head over to theriskpartners.com for more information about us and to listen to the other conversations in the series.